Hey everyone, it's me, Justina again. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the readings this week and the skills I'm trying to teach you this week so that we can build and do more difficult skills throughout the semester. So let's talk first of all, let's talk a little bit about the two readings that you've been given this week, right? So we have document 1 and document 2. Document 1 is here. It is a New York Times book review, right? It says Sunday book review. It's a book review about a book written about Christopher Columbus. That was a mouthful. So it is a secondary source, right? We're learning about Christopher Columbus from a historian who has looked at primary sources and has interpreted them and created his own assessments and analysis of that time period, right? So our other reading for the week is, let me scroll to the top, is this Castillo reading, The True History of the Conquest of New Spain, okay? And this, on the other hand, is a primary source. This text in italics is actually secondary information just to contextualize the reading. But then if we scroll back down, all of the text not in italics is actual primary source materials, meaning it was written during the time by somebody who lived through these experiences. And historians use an array of primary sources, written sources being one of those types, to understand, interpret, analyze, and to create historical secondary sources, right? So we're going to be reading an array of primary and secondary sources throughout the semester. I think it's important to learn about both, and so we're going to do both. But we also need an important skill that historians always do when they read both primary and secondary sources is something called sourcing, right? Seems a bit obvious. So I'm going to talk to you a little about sourcing today. And sourcing is especially important for reading primary sources. When you read primary sources, it's incredibly important to think about who wrote the source, when it was written, what kind of source is it, right? Is it a picture? Is it an artifact? Is it a text? Is it a letter? Is it a diary? Is it a government document? All of these are examples of primary sources, right? And it's important to figure out what kind of primary source it is to then interpret it, to think about who are they writing it for, why are they writing it, what is their purpose in writing it, are they trying to persuade someone, are they trying to just be an intimate diary, right? So if it's an intimate diary, how do we read that different than a government document that's trying to persuade maybe a group of people to voting on a policy, right? So these are all things that are really important to think about when you look at every primary source throughout the semester. So I have this chart that I use in all of my classes that is incredibly important to understanding and reading primary sources. I'm going to attach this to this page as well so you can look at this. And the questions are who, so who wrote the source? What is the topic? What is it about? Why basic ideas that come out of the text. When was it written or created? Where was it created? If it's a speech, where was it given? All these things. What was their purpose? This is incredibly important. We have to think about what the purpose of the document was, right? If it's a newspaper article, it's to report on something that happened, right? If it's a letter, it's to write to a friend or a colleague or a family member, right? All of these things are really important to understanding why, and that will give you greater understanding of the document as a whole and the meaning, and then it'll enrich the history for you. Also, how was it created? This is a little confusing. Think about format. Is it a letter? Is it a photograph? Is it a painting? Is it an artifact? Is it a diary entry? All those things. And then I usually put them together. But what I did in this week's assessment, when I ask you questions about document 2, which is the primary source reading for this week, I've given you these questions, right? So you need to answer them thinking about the documents itself. Okay. We also are reading a secondary source, right? So I have, conveniently, a secondary sourcing chart as well. And this one we're not going to answer all the questions on because most of these are some of these are related to more larger texts like historical books, right? Books that are written by historians and you need to think about their thesis and all these things. But because we do have a shortened secondary source with our book review this week, I do ask you some of these questions. And they differ than primary sources in an important way, right? We're talking about, again, who wrote the text, right? It's important to, when you're looking at secondary sources, especially some can be questionable, right? You want to see if the author is legitimate, right? So is it a historian who's trained and has used primary sources, right? Or is it a website that's a secondary source about a historical event that maybe was written trying to persuade people to believe them, and they didn't actually look at good primary sources, or they interpreted them in the way that they would help them persuade people. So secondary sources are not always necessarily truthful, right? And it is your job to find out if they are and to investigate that, right? So who wrote it? What is the topic of the text, right? So in this case, this week's going to be about Columbus and his exploration, right? And his interactions with native people and all these things, right? Those would all be topics. When was it written? This one's a kind of more intense than our primary source, because it's not only when was this secondary source written, but we also want to know what is the time period in which they're writing about, okay? And what was their purpose, right? So for a historian, typically their purpose is to interpret history in a new way, right? To look at the primary sources and to understand them in a way that other people have not looked at them before, right? These are all the questions that will be asked in your assessments, and these are all incredibly important basic skills that you will need to use throughout the semester. Every time we look at primary and secondary sources, you're going to need to ask these questions. So I'm going to attach both of these charts so that you can review them and to always think about them when you're reading documents. And please continue to think about these things, because we're going to use these basic skills of sourcing. I apologize. We're going to use these basic skills of sourcing to then to accomplish more intense skills, right? Writing a body paragraph, creating a thesis, all of these things. So please, I hope this helps, and think about sourcing, and good luck, and I hope you enjoy the readings. All right, I'll talk to you soon. Bye.